between Jimmy, Mary, and myself, Lenten Conversations. As you all know, we've sort of chosen the theme of change as our what we're structuring Lent around this year, and these conversations are pulling from each of those letters of the word change. We've been through courage and humility already, and today we're going to talk about angels.
We're halfway.
Yeah, and
That's
we're
right.
halfway
That's
through Lent.
right.
How about that?
Yeah, that's good.
Easter is closing in on us in a really good way. So when we first started talking among ourselves, the three of us, about how to choose topics based on the letters of the word change, I went through and actually read every gospel reading for the period of Lent, and just tried to choose a few words from each one that jumped out at me. And the words that jumped out at me were the words from Mark's account of Jesus's baptism. He gets baptized, comes out of the water, the voice comes from somewhere and identifies Jesus as my son, my beloved, and then immediately Jesus is driven out into the wilderness. And I'm going to read this because I want to get it verbatim the way that Mark puts it. The Spirit immediately drove him out into the wilderness. He was in the wilderness 40 days, tempted by Satan, and he was with the wild beasts, and the angels waited on him. And that just jumped out at me for a couple of reasons. You know, one is Mark doesn't really mention angels anywhere else in his account of the life of Jesus, whereas we have lots of angels in the other Gospels, right? An angel comes to Mary and explains to Mary what's going on with her and giving birth to the Son of God. The angels show up to the shepherds in the birth story. The angels show up at the tomb. We don't get any of that in Mark, although in Mark it does say that there was a young man in a white robe at the tomb. Doesn't identify the young man as an angel. I think we can probably assume that probably was an angel.
Yeah, an angel.
But anyway, so this just kind of jumped out at me. He was with the wild beasts and served by the angels. And as the three of us were talking about this yesterday, of course, we were like, served by the angels. Like, well, hello, my name's Michael. I'll be your server today.
That's right.
What would
Gabriel, Raphael, let me put my flaming sword in the scabbard and take your order, Jesus.
So that's an odd wording of it. And I think what I'd like to do to kick off this little conversation today is we question that Jesus was served by the angels. And
Yeah, and I think I think we all have some sense that sometimes when we immerse ourselves in the story and we're looking for the details of the story, one of the things that we do is we track it back to that original language, that it at least it's presented in widespread, and we, that word waited, because we were, Mary, you were like, was it like waited on, or like, we're waiting for you, Jesus, like, okay, 37 days, you got 3 more days in the wilderness, and that word, that Greek word diakonon, which, we get the diaconate from, this idea of serving or ministering, or maybe even a better word for the way that the language that we use today is caring for him. Like he was not you know, the animals were his companions, and I love like living in this region and thinking of the grizz and the badger and the elk and the bison are there, you know, as his companions. Like, you are not alone out here. And then the angels are providing care for him. But to some degree, like at the end of Mark, you were mentioning with that young man, is he or isn't he? There's still a measure of mystery around angels in the way that we talk about them and the way that we interact with them.
And the way that we don't really talk about them, too. I mean, I think that's something that we could probably recognize, is that angels aren't a topic of conversation in our Episcopal tradition. At least you probably won't hear us talking much about them from the pulpit, other than mentioning that they showed up on the scene.
Right.
But, so that made me wonder, because angels are all over the place in the Hebrew scriptures. They perform really important roles, and in our Gospels and in our New Testament too, right? And it occurred to me that angels tend to show up at crux moments in people's lives and in the story, and to sort of do some of the heavy lifting of explaining and translating the actions of God in the world. And Mary's, the Annunciation to Mary is the one that comes up to me right away.
Well, I think, we talked about this a little bit, that they come at those transitional times.
Yep.
And what the story would look like if the angel hadn't come to Mary or to Joseph or any of those stories along the way. How would Mary have made that leap? How would she have understood what was happening in her life, which was pretty profound? And I think if she hadn't had that angel moment, I don't know that she would have known how to move forward or how to understand what was happening in her life. And so the angel is such a critical part of those times. And when things that are very, that we can't understand in our human life happen, so they play an important part in the story. And it's interesting to think about as though angels were something that happened back in the day, right?
And not anymore.
And not anymore. Or if they do, they're sort of these very unique experiences. But is there another role or another way that angels show up in our lives today that we're just not, we just don't recognize as easily?
Yeah. I thought when we were talking yesterday and y'all brought that reality to the story and to our conversation of like, oh, it seems like angels manifest themselves in the lives of people during times of transition. I was like, oh my God, that's so insightful. And part of that insight, and I've shared this with y'all before, but maybe not in the same way, is this experience that I had that was unusual, not strange, but not usual. I told you, I've had an experience with an angel. Y'all are like, oh, great, do tell, and it's something that I do feel a little vulnerable telling the story because it is an unusual occurrence. But there was a time of transition. It was a time of transition in my life where I was really struggling about how I would occupy a role like this, the one that I serve. And I was in my childhood home, though not living there at the time. I was a young adult, but visiting my childhood home, and had a very real presence of an angel on an evening where in the midst of my struggle to determine sort of who I was in this role going forward, this angel who looked quite similar to the sort of angels that you see, painted in the Renaissance, but not totally, not completely. The message that was delivered to me was just peace. Just preach peace, teach peace. And it wasn't an experience that took my breath away. It was a calming and grounding experience. It was very settling, though it was unusual and sort of dressed with mystery. And I remember after the angel went away, kind of taking an assessment of myself of, was I asleep? Or no, I wasn't asleep. Am I imagining things? No, I'm not. I'm just, I'm sitting in my childhood bedroom at 9 o'clock in the evening after eating dinner with my mom and watching a little TV, and now I'm going to go read a book, but an angel showed up. And but it's been helpful to talk about that experience and to kind of share it, especially in the sense that, and y'all probably know this of me, like I just don't seem to have charismatic gifts where that would normally happen to me. I mean, I certainly know people who've angels all the time.
Yep.
And I'm not one of those people. And then Mary, we were talking about, other times in life where we feel like grounded and open and touched. And I was like, yeah, I call that the Holy Spirit.
Right.
Not like the angel thing was different. But to get back to our conversation, I did feel a real measure of care there.
Interesting.
Like it wasn't someone calling me out and making a demand on my life, but care in the way of you can, this is well within your range of ability, and you can occupy the role well. In fact, maybe you were made for it in a cool, kind of cool way.
I so appreciate you sharing that, because it is vulnerable, because it is not the Holy Spirit visits, which I think are pretty more common, perhaps, of those that thinner connection with the other, the whatever else that is. It's more of a supernatural experience, and we aren't as open to those things in this time, in our very logical 21st century brains, right? That is something that's different. And so I think it is vulnerable to share those moments, and I really appreciate, because they're real.
Yeah,
right?
real. And this idea that here we sit in a time of change, a time of transition, and to be able to have some expectation and assurance that God has many ways of caring for us as we endure times of transition. We endure the anxiety and the confusion that those times of transition bring forth into our lives. And then just the measure of this is a time of great change. I might walk out of this church, turn the corner, and bump into an angel.
Right.
Don't be surprised.
Right.
Well, and I think, I know for myself, I often wish I would have that experience.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
the experiences that I have had of those other sorts of experiences have been transformational in my life. And I always think, I'd love to have that angel experience.
Yeah.
But most of us don't get that.
Yeah.
Or at least we're not conscious of it. Maybe we're not open enough to it or something. And that time in your life, you were open to that experience. And so
And
we
I
talk.
think the openness was struggle.
Sure.
It was related to the
Yeah.
struggle.
Right. That makes sense.
there.
Which is
Yeah.
definitely backed up in Scripture, right? Those are the moments that angels show up when there's
Wait, I'm pregnant?
Hold
wait,
everything.
The tomb is empty.
Right. Yeah, they're not just there to celebrate the good times. It's for a purpose.
Yep. Well, I'm a little jealous too. I mean, I've always wanted to have that experience. No, I have,
Yeah,
and maybe especially since I put this on, I sort of feel like, oh gosh, Brian, You better have. Why haven't you had this?
It needs to be on the resume, is what you're saying. November 11th. Yeah.
But what I've been thinking about as I've been, thinking about this conversation and about angels sort of in general, even though I've never had the experience in the moment, I've been kind of replaying inexplicable, unexplainable moments in my life where I have been cared for by another person, sometimes by a stranger, sometimes by a family member or a person that I knew, and wondering, well, I think it's especially when one has been helped by a stranger, right? Just opening up the possibility within myself, within my rational way of thinking, that could have been an angel.
Yeah.
You know,
I like that
Right,
idea.
absolutely.
And I do find it comforting.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one more thing that I would love for us to talk about is just this idea that, you know, we those spiritual people on the ground like us regularly say things like, well, I was wrestling with my demon. But we have a story in our canon of Scripture about wrestling with an angel. And so I'm wondering what you guys think about wrestling with angels and how that, do you find that? Like, you know, you like Jacob have been grappling with an angel at any time in your life?
It's a great question. And I love the metaphor of wrestling with an angel.
Yeah.
Because wrestling is a very embodied activity, and we don't always, I mean, we fight with our enemies, but we wrestle sometimes with people that we love.
Yeah.
And perhaps
Or people that love us.
and people that love
Right.
us.
Yeah.
And if, I don't know, I mean, I tend to sort of psychologize this whole angel demon thing, and I'm also opening myself up to the possibility that these aren't just, you know, things that are happening in our minds, but these are perhaps things that are happening in the real world with us, in our embodied state, right?
Yeah.
And so wrestling with angels, I can't think of a specific incident right now, but I love the idea, and it's an idea that I would like to explore more fully.
It's interesting. We talked a little bit about this earlier, that you have this wrestling, and you get the picture of the the angel on the one shoulder and the devil on the other, because I think it's not like you're fighting with the angel or the devil. There is the conflict, and you are being pulled in one of those two directions, and you're being pulled to your higher self or your more base self, right? And so that sense of maybe it's not one or the other, but maybe it's a battle between the two, and you are trying to, which direction are you moving in?
Yeah.
And I think that that resonates more with me, this idea of it's a single battle, and there are these two pulls on you.
Yeah, and I like that idea of, there's just resistance there, but when we're wrestling with an angel, we are resisting, becoming greater,
Right.
or, better, or having deeper connection with our belovedness. And then, on the flip side with the demon or the devil, our struggle is just the struggle that we have with our brokenness, and only identifying with our brokenness and our woundedness and that shadow side of our life. And so it could be wrestling with either or both and at the same time, but this idea that one of the ways that God cares for us is to, put us in a supernatural struggle when we are resisting the goodness that God has sown into our lives, to, put a being in there that's seeking to pull us back toward goodness or depth. Or
I just think about how different your experience would have been with the angel if either the angel was asking something of you that you felt you couldn't or weren't capable, didn't have the resources to do, whether it was peace or whatever else it was, and you resisted that. It wouldn't have felt like, it might not have felt like an angel experience. I don't know.
Yeah, or to have an angel show up and say like, man, Jimmy, you're pretty disorganized and not great at email. Like, no, I don't need that. I already know that, that's not where I want to struggle,
Right.
I want to struggle toward my,
Right.
Sure. So I guess maybe this is making me think about times in my life where someone came to me and did point out the truth to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, well, no, I don't think so.
There it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can come up with a lot of arguments and a lot of rationalizations against what you're telling me, even though they were telling me the truth.
Yeah.
Right.
Wow.
So that's one way
Defensive mode
I
immediately,
believe
right?
that we might struggle with that I may have struggled with angels in my own life was when some truth was very obvious to me that I didn't want to hear.
Right.
And because I didn't want to hear it, then I didn't have to act on it.
Yeah. Or to go back to last week to humility. Like, well, no, no, you're not supposed to dim your light. That's not what humility is.
Right.
Humility is just like that honest and authentic connection of, sublimating the ego, but still being yourself. And that, those angels do try to pull us out of that false humility, that negative sense of self, into a more positive expression.
Yeah. Well, my hope is that you all that are watching this don't just watch it, that this also sparks conversations for you all, with your families, with your friends, with your angels maybe.
Yeah.
And I don't mean to wrap this up or anything, there's more, but that just occurred to me is that these conversations in general, we're hoping that you don't just watch them, we're hoping that you continue that conversation.
Yeah, at least keep your eyes open for what's around the corner or on the other side of the rock or the tree.
Yeah.
Because we never know.
No. Were you going to say something?
No, I was just, we had talked about the angels and the wild beasts, and we didn't talk about the wild beasts today, and I think that would take us down a whole nother path. But just sort of food for thought, as they're out there talking about this with friends and family, I love this concept. There's nothing, when you first start talking about angels and wild beasts, the wild beasts in my mind are always threatening in some way.
Grizzly bears.
And I love that they are in
Rattlesnakes.
companionship with the wild beasts.
Yeah.
And that just got me thinking about sort of our connection to, the world around us, to nature, to wilderness. And I love just Jesus's connectedness with the earth. It's not a separate thing. It is companionship. And so you have these you have the testing, this companionship with wild beasts, and the care of the angels. It's sort of a beautiful mixture there. So I just wanted to throw that out there for people to think about, that natural piece of it and that creatureliness of Jesus and that connectedness with the wilderness. It doesn't feel threatening when you read that passage.
Right. Well, and Jimmy pointed out to us that, this is perhaps this wilderness description in Mark is perhaps a description of Eden.
Yeah.
I mean, the components are there, right? The wild beasts, integration with creation, Satan.
Yep.
Yep.
The serpent, the craftiest creature in the garden. Yeah.
And the angels.
Yeah.
And so that gave me a different way of thinking about this time in the wilderness. Okay? And I've looked at this past year as our collective time in the wilderness.
Sure.
More in the terms of like wandering around the Sinai desert for what has felt like 40 years in the last year. But then to also think that, gosh, maybe we're wandering around in Eden too.
And to think about, maybe y'all have had this experience before when you've been on the trail, and I would ascribe this as a masculine behavior, but maybe it's
I'll let you
not,
know.
but it probably is. You will let me know, and I'm grateful for that.
Thank you for that.
But that, I think we can look like, I'm going to get on top of that mountain and I'm going to conquer it, or I'm going to do this trail in a certain amount of time and I'm going to conquer it. And then we don't, because we're not meant to conquer creation. We're meant to cooperate with it. But when we adopt a more cooperative or harmonious position, even in the wilderness, we can see how cooperative the wilderness is and how, if I slow my pace and I'm more conscious of, taking water from creation and putting it back into my body. And it's a much more pleasant way to live or to be rather than this just like, And I love the image of Jesus when we really take out each detail of his temptation there in the wilderness and look at it. It's much more cooperative than it is combative. And there is that back and forth, like, oh, you think you're the beloved Son of God? I would assure you you're probably not, that. But no, in those moments of struggle, we're not alone.
Right.
Both the wild beasts and the angels are there.
Right, and that dynamic you're describing is that relationship between the demons and the angels, right? And we talk about, like, I'm going to conquer my demons. No, you're not.
Yeah.
It's not about conquering.
Yeah.
It is about
Just own them.
Yeah.
So interesting. Thank you, guys.
Yeah.
Thanks, Brian.
Yeah, thank you guys, and thank you all for tuning in.
Yes, thank you.
So next week, CHAN.
I can't remember what the N is. You'll have to check the website for what the N is.
And I guess we better check too, so that we know what to talk about next.
Right.
But
we always
will
have
be
something
here
to talk about.
We will be here, same time, same station.
And some N-word.
Yeah.
That's right.
All right, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks
Have
for
a great
everything.
week.
Bye.